But Harding dies, and Calvin Coolidge becomes the next president. Now, Coolidge is vacationing in Vermont with his family when he receives word of Harding's death. There's no way to get a message to Coolidge through a telephone. The house he's staying at has a telephone, but it doesn't work very often. So a messenger has to come to the house, and they tell him that Harding has died. So Calvin Coolidge's father swears him in as president on the family Bible. Now, Calvin Coolidge is born in Vermont on the 4th of July in 1872, but he later moves to Massachusetts, and that's where his political career takes off. He grew up on a farm, and he was taught to work hard and be very frugal with money. His mother died when he was 12 years old, and Coolidge suffered from extreme shyness and anxiety throughout his life. He never really got over his mother's death. He attends college at Amherst in Massachusetts and graduates in 1895. After college, he read law and passed the bar exam. He ends up opening up his own law office. Then he starts to get involved in Republican politics in Massachusetts. He's mayor of Northampton for a while. He's city solicitor. He's a circuit court clerk. He's a representative to the Massachusetts General Court. He's later a Massachusetts state senator. He serves time as lieutenant governor, and then governor, and then he gets called to the vice presidency, and then when Harding dies, he becomes president. Now, Calvin Coolidge's nickname was Silent Cal. He didn't talk very much. There's kind of a funny story about how at a party at the White House, a woman came up to him and said this: "You must talk to me, Mr. President. I made a bet today that I could get you to say more than 2 words. And then all Calvin Coolidge says is, "You lose." So he's a very quiet man. A foreign diplomat once said that Coolidge could be silent in 5 languages. So Silent Cal, that's his nickname. Very quiet guy. Coolidge ends up meeting his future wife in 1904. Her name is Grace Goodhue. She's the total opposite of Coolidge. She's very outgoing, very sociable. She was a teacher at the Clark Institute for the Deaf in Northampton, Massachusetts. And they kind of have a funny way that they ended up meeting. One day she was watering flowers outside of a building, and she looked into this house with the window open, and she saw this guy in his long underwear and a top hat, and he was shaving. And when she sees this, she starts laughing because she thinks it's funny. The guy shaving kind of looked out the window and is embarrassed, so he shuts the window and closed the blinds. Later on, he goes and meets her, and he explained that he has this piece of hair that always falls down in his face when he shaves. So anytime he shaves, he always wears a top hat, so it keeps his hair out of his face. So the two are very different. He's very awkward and silent. She's very sociable and outgoing. But they end up falling in love. They get married in October of 1905. Now, Coolidge is a very down-to-earth president. He often would sit out on the White House porch in his rocking chair smoking a cigar. He would wave at people when they went by. He goes to bed very early and naps every day. He did not work near as hard as Harding did, but he does clean up a lot of the scandals of the Harding presidency. He basically gets a reputation for honesty and frugality. He doesn't drink or play cards or chase women or keep company with people who do, so he is completely opposite of Harding in that respect. Now, Coolidge is also against prohibition. He thinks the government should not violate people's liberties, but he said since it's the law of the land, we have to enforce the law. Coolidge supports big business in general. He kind of sees government as a necessary evil. Government often gets in the way of things. He vetoes something called the McNary-Hagen Bill. Basically, this bill would have had the government buy farmers' surplus produce and then dumped it on the international market just in an effort to kind of help farmers get by. Basically, Coolidge says it's not the government's job to help farmers make more money. They need to figure out how to do that on their own. He argues that cutting taxes is good because when you give more money back to the people, everyone does better. He reduces the national debt. He trims the federal budget, lowers taxes. Basically, he makes government smaller than when he found it. So he comes to the presidency in 1923, and when he leaves in 1929, the government is smaller than he found it. On immigration, Coolidge signed something called the National Origins Act of 1924. It basically reduces immigration by pushing the base for immigration back from 1920 to 1890. It also reduces the quotas from 3% to 2%. Coolidge was friendly to immigrants, but he often got their votes because he was friendly to them. But he believes in a resting period. He has this saying that it didn't matter if you came over on the Mayflower or just a boat a few months ago. Once you're in America, you're in the same boat as everyone who's been here forever. So that's why we need to learn English, study American civics and history. So he reduces immigration just like Harding does. Now, under Coolidge, we have something called Coolidge prosperity. The economy just takes off under him. The gross national product increases from $69 billion in 1921 to $93 billion in 1924. The consumer price index falls a few percentage points while he's president. The unemployment rate drops from 11.7% to 5%. Wages on average go up for workers. The only group that wages don't really go up for is farmers. They basically have lots of problems throughout the 1920s. I got a couple of quotes that he loved to share, and these are kind of what he's known for. He said, "If the federal government should go out of existence, the common run of people would not detect the difference." Another quote, "The chief business of the American people is business." And then finally, "The man who builds a factory builds a temple." So he's a very pro-business type of president. But he also warned against wealth. He said wealth is not a bad thing, but if that's the only thing you're chasing after, then that's a problem. He said, "Wealth should be used for worthwhile goals. The multiplication of schools, the increase of knowledge, the dissemination of intelligence, the encouraging of science, the broadening of outlook, the expansion of liberties, the widening of culture. So long as wealth is made the means and not the end, we need not greatly fear it." So he warns that if you're just trying to get wealthy, to flaunt your wealth, don't do that. But if you're going to use your wealth to benefit mankind, then go for it. Foreign policy, like I said earlier, the Republicans are not so much isolationists. They're more independent internationalists. That might be a way to kind of describe them. You know, anytime American interests or the Constitution conflict with something internationally, you need to side with America and the Constitution. He does pass something, or something does happen while he's president, called the Dawes Plan. Basically, this is the brainchild of Charles Dawes. So during World War I, the United States loaned a ton of money to England and France. Well, now that the war's over, America wants that money back. Well, France and Britain are struggling financially, so in order to pay back America, they end up taking money that Germany owes them through reparations. But the Germans struggle in the 1920s economically. They suffer high inflation during the 1920s, and they end up defaulting on their reparation payments. So after they default, the French invade Germany in 1922. They take over the Ruhr Valley, which is this industrial part of Germany. It's a very wealthy place. So what ends up happening is Vice President Charles Dawes, he gets promoted to Vice President after the election of 1924. He basically says American banks will loan Germany money. Germany will use that money to build back their industry and make money. Germany will then pay their reparations to France and England, and then France and England will repay their loans to the United States. Now, this is kind of a circular plan, and it works as long as the Americans keep introducing money into the German economy. As soon as the Americans stop doing that, this whole system falls apart. So when the Great Depression happens in 1929 and 1930, this plan is going to collapse. Now, Coolidge pushed something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact in 1928. Basically what this is the French Foreign Minister Aristide Briand and the American Secretary of State Frank Kellogg get together and they pass this thing called the Kellogg-Briand Pact that outlaws war. It basically says a nation can't pursue national policy goals through war. So if you have a border dispute with a neighbor, if you have a dispute between Germany and France over reparations, you can't invade a country or go to war to solve the issue. You have to solve it peacefully. 15 nations signed this in August 1920, and eventually 62 nations in all sign it. The American Senate approves it 85-1. So even though it's a piece of paper that outlaws war, it's an attempt to basically make sure World War I doesn't happen again. But once Hitler comes to power and Mussolini and the Japanese, this is a piece of paper, it doesn't really matter. There's also a lot of foreign intervention in Nicaragua during the 1920s. American troops are sent there as peacekeepers. There's kind of civil war in Nicaragua. This is very close to the Panama Canal. Eventually, the American troops help oversee a presidential election in 1928, and they're removed in the 1930s. So Coolidge has a lot of things he does internationally. Now, he has to run for re-election in 1924. He's finishing out Harding's term, so now he's going to run for election in his own right. Now, Coolidge is in a very good position in 1924. The economy's doing really good. The only thing that maybe could go against him is the scandals of the Harding administration. Will the nation remember that, or will they tell Coolidge, like, no, you handled that successfully, we'll elect you? The Republicans meet in Cleveland in June of 1924 for their convention. They nominate Coolidge for president and then Charles Dawes for vice president. The Democrats hold their convention in June and July 1924 in New York City. The Democrats have a crazy convention. The frontrunners are William Gibbs McAdoo and Al Smith. It's a very bitter convention. McAdoo represents the Protestants, the Dries, those in favor of prohibition, and the Southern Democrats in the Democrat Party. While Al Smith, he's a Catholic, he's from New York. He favors repealing prohibition, so he's called a wet. People that support prohibition are called Dries, and people that oppose prohibition are called wets. So Al Smith is the Catholic, urban, kind of wet candidate of the Democrat Party. The Ku Klux Klan has a presence at the convention. There was a bitter fight over whether or not to put a plank in their platform that denounced the Klan. It barely gets defeated, so officially the Democrat Party does not condemn the Klan. Some Klan members even try to burn a cross on the floor of the convention. Balloting goes on for a couple weeks, and eventually McAdoo and Al Smith drop out, and they reach a compromise candidate, John W. Davis for president and Charles W. Bryan for vice president. Charles W. Bryan is William Jennings Bryan's little brother. John W. Davis, he's the Democrat nominee in 1924. In the 1950s, he will argue in the Brown versus Board of Education case. He will say we want to continue segregation in schools. So when we get to the 1950s, we'll talk about that. Coolidge chooses not to campaign actively. It is his style to kind of remain silent, but he's also suffering the loss of his son. Him and his wife are grieving over their son. Their son Calvin Jr. had recently died. Now, he had gone outside to play tennis at the White House, and he kind of has a freak accident. He doesn't wear socks with his shoes, and he gets a blister, and then this blister gets infected, and he ends up dying of blood poisoning in a couple of weeks. So Coolidge is grieving over this. Charles Dawes does campaign for the Republicans and gives a lot of speeches. The Democrats campaign vigorously throughout the country. They try to get a debate between Davis and Coolidge. They think if they can debate the issues, they can beat Coolidge. But Coolidge kind of just stays off to the side and says, hey, things are running smoothly. Why do I need to go have a debate? He famously said, I don't recall any candidate for president that ever injured himself by not talking. So Coolidge kind of keeps quiet. There is a third party movement. The Progressive Party runs a candidate, Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin. He doesn't really accomplish anything. He only wins his home state. So the Republicans kind of run on Coolidge prosperity. They have a motto, keep cool with Coolidge. So as you can see from this map, huge victory for the Republicans. They win everything pretty much except the solid South. The South, like we've already talked about, always goes for the Democrats because of segregation. Robert M. La Follette wins his home state of Wisconsin, but that's it. Blacks vote for Coolidge, something like 90%. Women overwhelmingly vote for Coolidge. Voter turnout is down a lot. In 1920, voter turnout was about 70%, and in 1924, it's about 50%. So in Coolidge's second term, it's more of the same policies. There is a huge natural disaster during his second term. You have a huge flood that breaks the Mississippi River, breaks the levees. So it rains a lot in the summer of 1927, the spring and summer, and then in April of 1927, levees on the Mississippi River break, and the Mississippi River escapes its embankments. Fences, houses, and livestock are swept away. As many as 1,000 people are killed, and over 700,000 are left homeless. Calvin Coolidge puts Herbert Hoover in charge of helping the people that are affected by this flood. Hoover oversees the Mississippi Flood Committee, and he's basically given wartime powers by Coolidge to deal with this. So Hoover comes to the rescue. Hoover has the nicknames the Great Engineer and the Great Humanitarian. He sets to work directing aid to those affected. He divides his work into 3 stages. First he focuses on rescuing people from the flooding. Then he devotes himself to taking care of the refugees that are kind of fleeing the flood. And then he works on economic rehabilitation. How can we get people back on their farms, get them back to work? Some 35,000 people work for him in trying to help with this flood relief. He puts together $50 million of private money. He's so efficient that less than 1% of that $50 million is used for overhead. He moves some 350,000 people into refugee villages. Now, Hoover deals with all sorts of problems relating to the flood, and he even has to deal with problems created by other humans. Segregation is enforced in the camps in the South, these refugee camps. Aid is often handed out by local agencies or by local people who support segregation. Blacks are forced to live in segregated camps, and sometimes they're even prohibited from leaving these camps until the plantation owners who they work for come and get them. So it's almost like they're enslaved in these refugee camps again. Hoover puts together a commission of blacks to kind of look into this. This is called the Moton Commission. It's named after Dr. Robert Moton. The commission shares its findings with Hoover. They say that blacks are treated terribly in these camps. They're segregated. Their liberties are violated. So Hoover basically works to implement their recommendations. Now, after 3 months of work, Hoover declares that the crisis is over. He states, quote, "The people of the valley are settling their own problems the people of the valley are settling their own problems of rehabilitation without a great deal of outside help. It is upon such independence and self-government that is based the greatness of the United States." Now, in August of 1928, Coolidge announces that he will not seek another term as president, so he's not going to run for president in 1928. Many people feel that he could have run. The economy is doing really well. The Republican Party dominates national politics. Some people, though, think that Coolidge knew a depression was coming in the next few years, so he wanted to get out while the economy was still good. Maybe this is true. Probably he was just grieving from his son still, and his father had recently died, so he probably was just tired of being president. So basically this leaves the Republican field wide open, but the Republicans end up nominating Herbert Hoover for president in 1928. Now, Hoover was born in Iowa in August of 1874. He was born to Quaker parents. Hoover will be the first president born west of the Mississippi. Now, he has a very tragic childhood. Both his parents died, and he was orphaned by the age of 10. He ends up being sent to live with relatives. Eventually, he's sent to Oregon to live with an uncle who had recently lost his son. Out in Oregon, he takes classes in business school at night. He works as an office boy and assistant bookkeeper during the day. Hoover eventually goes to Stanford University and becomes a mining engineer. He works all sorts of jobs at college to make ends meet. He was a typist at the school. He waited tables, picked up laundry. He delivered newspapers. Hoover is a very hard worker. He might be one of the hardest working presidents we've ever had. He's also very shy. But he does manage to get elected treasurer of the entire student body at Stanford. Now, this is the only thing he gets elected to before becoming president. He never officially ran for anything political in his life until he runs for president. Now, while he's at Stanford, he meets his future wife, Lou Henry. She's a fellow kind of geology and mining student. Hoover ends up graduating in 1895, and he gets a job working in the mines as a miner, so he actually carries a pick and a shovel. He makes $2.50 a day, and he works for 10 hours every day. Later, he moves to San Francisco and takes a job as a typist. Later, he works in New Mexico in a mine. His job is to look for gold. But basically, he is such a good mining engineer that he gets hired by international companies to travel the world looking for precious minerals. So he travels to Australia, China, India, New Zealand, Hawaii, Egypt, Korea, Ceylon, Russia. Travels all over the world basically mining for precious metals. He's in China when the Boxer Rebellion happens. He helps barricade the streets during a siege, so he's kind of on the front lines of that conflict. In 1908, he starts his own mining firm, and by age 40, he had made some $4 million, so he's a very rich man, and he decides to retire and devote himself to public service. So he quits making money for himself and just goes to work for the country. So for the next 40 years, anytime he gets a paycheck from the government, he just signs it over to charity. So think about that. The first 40 years of his life, he worked for himself, and then the next 40 years of his life, he ends up working for the American people for free. Now, he is a progressive Republican. He's not a conservative Republican. He supported Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 for president. During World War I, Hoover is in London when the war breaks out in 1914. He uses his own money to basically help get 120,000 Americans home. He provides food and clothing and housing for them for 6 weeks until ships can be gathered to take them home. So think about that, using your own private money, raising private money to take care of 120,000 people for 6 weeks, and then finding ways to ship them home across the Atlantic. That would take a lot of energy and money. Hoover organizes the Committee for the Relief of Belgium. During the war, he doesn't get any help from the United States government in this. He raises something like $1 billion to purchase food, clothing, and medicine for people affected by the war in Europe. He helps to keep some 10 million people from starving in Europe. He comes back home and runs the Food Administration during World War I, so he does work for the Wilson administration. After the war is over, he goes back to Europe. He works every day for 11 months straight, feeding and clothing those affected by the war. He even helps get food and clothing and medicine to the communist Russia. You know, he despises communism. He's against communism, but he also helps the people of Russia. The Russian writer Maxim Gorky said this: "You have saved from death 3.5 million children and 5.5 million adults." So he praises Hoover for helping the Russians during their civil war, helping to feed them. Hoover's reputation is one of the best in the United States. The Democrats, including FDR, want him to run for president in the 1920s as a Democrat, but he does announce in 1920 that he's a Republican. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist at the Peace Conference, he said that Mr. Hoover is the only man who emerged from the ordeal of Paris with an enhanced reputation. So Hoover was at the Peace Conference in 1919, and a lot of people think he was the only one that really was smart about things. Now, Calvin Coolidge does not have a good opinion of Herbert Hoover. Coolidge thinks Hoover is too progressive. Coolidge famously said, "That man has offered me unsolicited advice for 6 years, all of it bad." So he does not think Hoover has what it takes to be a good president. Now, the Republicans hold their convention in Kansas City in 1928, and Hoover wins on the first ballot. Senator Charles Curtis is nominated for vice president. Now, in his acceptance speech, Hoover says this: "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We have not yet reached the goal, but given a chance to go forward with the policies of the last 8 years, we shall soon, with the help of God, be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation. Now, he said this to a crowd of 75,000 people in the Stanford football stadium. Another 30 million people heard this over the radio. So basically, the Republicans in their platform promised to continue Coolidge prosperity. They support the protective tariff, sound money policies, and efficiency in government. Now, the Democrats hold their convention in Houston, Texas. They do not want a repeat of 1924, where Al Smith and William Gibbs McAdoo slugged it out for weeks. Instead, they end up nominating Al Smith. They touted the scandals of Harding's that had occurred a number of years ago. The Democrats say that they support collective bargaining for labor. They want a lower tariff. They want non-intervention in Latin America. And they want to give subsidies to farmers. So that's kind of what the Democrats say they stand for. Now, probably the most important event at the convention in 1928 for the Democrats is that FDR, who has been missing from politics because of polio, he gives the nomination speech, the speech that nominates Al Smith. He walks up on stage, he has braces on, and his son kind of helps him walk. So most people that see him don't really know that he's paralyzed because it looks like he's walking. So FDR is kind of made the center of attention in 1928, and this helps relaunch his political career. Now, the Republicans campaign on a slogan of 2 chickens in every pot and 2 cars in every garage, so more of the prosperity of the 1920s. Hoover doesn't really campaign. He basically just delivers 6 major addresses that he himself writes. Smith uses the radio and tries to reach voters, but he had this funny New York accent, and to a lot of Americans and the rest of the country, it doesn't sound very good. Smith wasn't too different than Hoover on a lot of policies. He often runs this Me Too campaign. Hoover will say, I stand for prosperity, I stand for this. And then Smith will say, me too, I also stand for that. So the voters kind of say, well, if you stand for the same things as Hoover does, why should we vote for you? The Republicans have been doing just fine. One of the examples of this is Al Smith says he stands for a protectionist tariff. So he's kind of different than a lot of the regular Democrats. But some of the things that hurt Smith is he's Catholic. This is still a Protestant nation. Most Americans don't trust Catholicism yet. Smith is also a supporter of, or he's against prohibition, so he's a wet. He wants to do away with prohibition. A lot of people don't like this. He's also a very urban politician, so a lot of America is still rural at this point. So it's a huge landslide for Hoover. Hoover gets 21.5 million votes to Al Smith's 15 million votes. Hoover wins 444 electoral votes to Smith's 87. You can see from this map, Hoover even wins a lot of the former states that were the Confederate States of America during the Civil War. So the Republicans finally start winning some southern states. You know, the Republicans almost never win the South because the South supports segregation, and the Republican Party is the political party for civil rights for blacks. But the Republicans are doing so well with the economy that even some of the southern states vote for them. The Republicans win a majority of over 100 people in the House. They have a 17-seat majority in the Senate. FDR runs for governor of New York, and he barely wins New York. He carries New York by 25,000 votes, even though Hoover won it by 100,000. So this is just a huge electoral victory for the Republicans. But as we'll see coming up, the Great Depression is about to hit, and pretty soon the Republicans are going to be wiped off the map, and the Democrats are going to start winning elections all over the place.